mainly around security in terms of how do you, set up your users, groups, and permissions for them to do certain things in Azure Cloud. Okay, so let's get started. Unless you guys have any questions. I see very thin presence today. What happened? Where is Viral and everybody? Okay. So when you talk about any enterprise, right, which has a some sort of an IT division, right, which is responsible for not only deploying applications, etc., but they're also responsible for managing the IT resources, which is provided to the employees and the staff and everyone, right? Nowadays, if you go to an IT company or any company generally, right, first thing you get is a laptop, right? So now laptop will be company given laptop most of the time. So how do they manage that, right? How do they manage you as an employee? How do they manage your access to your laptop? And through the laptop, you can access the organizational resources, right? So how do you do that? Correct. So that's where the IAM comes into picture. IAM stands for Identity and Access Management, right? Identity means who you are. Access management means what you can do, right? In simple terms, we talk about authentication and authorization. So authentication is more related to your identity. Authorization is more related to what you can access, right? And this is a very basic functionality in any organization. When you join any organization, that they need to make sure that you are uniquely identifiable within their systems. And second, they need to provide you enough resources with the control that you can do your stuff. And then you have controls over what you can do and what you cannot do within the organization, right? So that's the basic stuff which any organization needs in IT infrastructure. And that's why it is very important for the cloud providers to provide you a similar functionality in the cloud as well. Okay, let's look at like what these concepts are quickly. Most of them you might be aware. So first thing is the users, groups, and permission. So users is something which has an identity. So you can think like any employee joining an organization is a user of organization's resources, right? So you might be using the organization's phone or organization's computer, and then applications, and then other stuff like printers, scanners, whatever, right? So those are the users we are talking about. Then we have user groups. Generally, groups is created to manage the users, or simplify the management of the users. Because from the organization's perspective, it's a large organization, even in the medium-sized organizations, right? You might have employees doing certain functions, right? So you might have employees to do HR functions. You might have employees to do IT functions. You might have employees to do, application development, right? So those are like set of, you can say, personas of identities, right? Now, when you work with an HR department, let's say you have 50 employees in HR department, they might be doing similar kind of work, or they need, to share the access or the resources in a similar way. They might be working on similar applications, right? So you want to manage their accessibility, or simplify the management of the accessibility by creating groups. You can create like HR group, or you can create IT group, or you can create a research group, and then manage those users, right, accordingly. So grouping is basically to simplify the management of the users. And then finally, the permissions, which gives you the access, like what you can do, what you cannot do. Okay. Now, in simple terms, like when you do organize or when the employees or users are joint organizations, you give some kind of an identity to them to uniquely identify them. So you might have like a unique email address, or you may have a unique employee ID you can use to identify yourself everywhere, right? And then to go along with that, like if you're face to face, you may have like things like um, the scanners or the punching machine where you can you can use a thumb to identify yourself, right? But if you're working virtually and accessing the applications, right, they may not have those kind of things there to physically identify. So they provide you password, for example, right? So you can use a password to identify yourself with the resources which need that kind of access, right? So you can have like username, passwords, email to identify yourself in terms of access to organization's resources. So that's a simple way, right? But then nowadays you have like very high level of securities. For example, you might have like multi-factor authentication, right? Meaning password may not be enough for you to identify yourself because password can be compromised, password could be looked upon, you might have stored it or written it somewhere, somebody can get to it, right? So then do you have like second level of authentication, like something you own, for example, like a phone, right? So they might ask you to register your device and then send you a one-time password every time you try to access certain sensitive resources, right? So we call it OTP or other mechanisms, right? So there are a lot of advanced functionality on those authentication side of it or the identity side of it, right? And then organizations have been improving that. So what they are expecting in the cloud also to have a similar functionality, right? Like things like multi-factor authentication or fine-grained access, meaning you can go to the lowest level of the resource access and then define that what you can do. So for example, if you are given access to a file, right? Can you prevent the access to only certain part of the file, for example? Also certain application, but in the application, you can do only certain things in the application, right? So that's a fine-grained access, right? So you can define access based on the lowest level of the resource. So those kind of like advanced functionality is now expected in cloud as well, because that is implemented already in data centers. And then when they move to the cloud, they're expecting more and more things like that. Okay. Things like other guest user access. Maybe the users are not part of the organization, but you want to give them some temporary access to certain things in the organization. I think we talked about that in storage, right? Where you can provide a particular file or a blob access based on certain timings, right, on the particular file, right? So those kind of advanced usage is also implied when you're talking about identity and access.
So a lot of these roles can be automated, right?
When
Like-
you say
Like
automated,
permission groups, make sure, if you deploy a laptop to user, user should just sign in and he'll get all the permissions and groups, right?
yes. So what happens is, like, let's say,
Because that's what I do now, is like, I log the user in, I don't have to go to AD and give him all these permissions.
yeah. So what happens is, like, when you have a new employee joining, right? So a new user comes in, you know that he's going to join, let's say, development team, right?
Yes.
So what you do is when you define that user in the AD, you just say he's going to be part of the development group. The permissions are already attached to the group. So all the permissions which is available to other developers, they will get automatically. So you don't have to do for each user, you don't have to define. And that's why the groups and permissions are very important.
Yeah, it's less administration.
Yeah, so it's a simplifying the administration. In fact, nowadays, I'll show you the capability where you don't have to even put, you don't have to even create static groups. You can create dynamic groups, right? So based on certain condition, that employee which you are creating will be part of certain groups automatically.
Yeah.
Right, based on the department or based on the manager or whatever you create in the user registry, they go to a particular group and they get the permissions. So there's a lot of ways you can simplify the management, right? So your user, your group, right? So those are we call it principal or identities, right? Role and permissions are way to provide them the access. Think like this: a user has a role has certain set of permissions. So, for example, user is a developer, right? So his role in the organization is a developer, right? So now role and groups could be similar things, right? So either you put them in the developer group or you can assign a developer role. Ultimately, role has set of permissions and group has set of permissions, right? Based on that, the user gets a particular access in the organization, right? Now, permissions um, uh, in cloud can be defined in many ways. Generally, they are defined as part of the policies. So generally, you might get a policy document for each permission, and we'll talk. And you can create the groups in whichever way you want, right? Because there are a lot of flexibilities there, but then you need to decide what kind of things you need to do. Now, when I say you, that means anybody who is responsible for user group roles and enterprise management. Make sense, right? Is responsible for that. So you can create groups based on their role. You can create groups based on their department. You can create groups based on their location, whatever the way you want to do it. Things to remember that is you are creating the group to manage their access in bulk, right? So when you create the groups, you need to think about like, will it apply to many users? Then you create the group, right? If you create an HR group and you don't give enough permissions, and every time you have to modify the permissions for each user, it doesn't help. Make sense? When you create the groups, you need to always make sure that they have some kind of common permissions and access, right? That way you're simplifying their access management and not compromising your enterprise security. That's very important, right?
So they'll fall under like security team, right? The IAM group,
Yeah, generally this falls under the security.
because we have that at work.
Yeah.
We have like this group and they don't want to do all the access.
Yeah, so generally what happens is like when you do IAM is done by security administrator. So they have role of security administrator. So whenever a user joins, a request goes to them saying, hey, your new employee, can you
Right, yep.
create a profile for them? So they will go and create the profile. Okay. But as an architect, you should be giving them recommendations how they should do it. Make sense?
Like the security group.
Yeah. So you should be giving your recommendations to the security group or how to use the cloud to do certain things. Right. So they might come to you saying, hey, should we do the groups or should we use the roles or should we use the tenant or should we use the administrative units and things like that? Because in cloud, terminology is slightly different and functionality is slightly different than what you get in the on-prem, right? So that's where you come into picture. So when you say you are a Azure administrator or you are an Azure solution architect, right? They might ask you a recommendation like, hey, we have something like this setup in our on-prem, but now we are going to Azure. What do you think? How should we handle this aspect of security? Make sense, right? So, but the grouping users role permissions, those are like all the common concepts. They know like for that they're not going to come to you to say to take an recommendation, but they might say okay, we want to implement, let's say, multi-factor authentication, or we want to implement certain password rules and things like that, right? So you might be helping them out with those. So in order to do this, you need an enterprise software, right, which can manage all of these things, right? So there are different software available. Most of the software are now called directory or enterprise directories, right? So in an enterprise, when you want to set up your users' access and permissions and things like that, you will have something like enterprise directories deployed in the enterprise. Right? So on-prem, so for example, one of the most popular directory is the Active Directory, which is a Microsoft product. So almost like 60 to 70% organizations nowadays are using Active Directory as their enterprise directory, right? So Active Directory is one of the server software you can use to set up all of those things. There are other directories as well. There is an IBM directory, there is a Red Hat one, and so on and so forth, right? And nowadays, those directory access is kind of standardized. So you can link between two directories using protocols like LDAP, for example. So you might hear something like LDAP, right? So LDAP is like a directory access protocol, irrespective of which directory you're working with. It could be Active Directory, it could be an IBM directory, it could be Apache directory or whatever, right? But the role of the directory is, the core role of the directory is to manage the users, groups, permissions, and their access, okay? And then it may have some additional functionality. So before I jump into Azure AD, let me give you some background about, as I said, the most popular directory, which is an Active Directory, how it is deployed, what it does, so you will understand when you move to the cloud, how to handle certain functions. Okay, let me go to our favorite page.
Great job.
So when you have Active Directory, right? Now understand there is a subtle difference between a Windows Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. But core functionality is still similar. So first of all, it is a kind of a directory for organization, right? So like we have Yellow Pages, right? It is a telephone directory. Right? Similarly, Active Directory is an employee or organization directory. So what does it provide us? It has a hierarchical structure. It has a root, for example. So it represents an organization structure. And then we can have maybe things like this, right? You might have departments, right? You're under department, your employee, right? And then your employees and then groups and things like that. So basically, it's a directory with a hierarchical structure. Okay, you can put a flat structure of employees as well, and then assign to the groups and things like that. But what are the core functionalities of the directory? Right, it has a user information. You want to find any user within the organization, you can go to the Active Directory and find out. Right. So the first thing is it has a user functionality. What does the user have? User has a lot of things. I said what user is like. What are the properties of the user? Right. So it might have an identity, as I said. We call it principal, for example, in Active Directory. Principal is a way to identify a user. It might have the user info, like for example, name, right, address, right, personal info. It might have organizational info, like which department they work in, who is their manager, right, which group they belong to. Make sense? So this is one of the core content of the directory. The second core content of the directory is groups. You can define your groups, right? You might have an admin group, you might have an HR group, you might have a sales group, and so on and so forth. Right? And then you can have a permission. These are the core functionalities. Right? So what does it allow us to do? Users can use their principal, right, to access any organization's resource. For example, you will have your email ID or employee ID, right? You can, in your password, you can use it to get to the, access your applications, access your meeting rooms, book your meeting rooms, and things like that, right? So Active Directory, on top of these things, can also manage the organizational resources. For example, devices, right? Means all the computers, right, used by the organization can be registered in the Active Directory and can be assigned to the users. Make sense? So when generally company gives you a laptop, that laptop is already registered in Active Directory, its number and everything, and then it is assigned to a particular user, right? So what it means is this user can access this device, for example, right? They might give you mobile phones. This also can be done in Active Directory.
Mobile phones.
Yeah, so if company gives you a mobile phone, right?
They use int now. Int, MDM.
It doesn't matter what they use. First, you have to register that device. Otherwise, it will not allow you to access any resource.
Oh,
Okay. Yeah. So they register it, and that's why you are able to get to certain applications on your mobile phone for your company. Yeah. So if you try to like authenticate with your mobile, but it's not the company given mobile, it will not allow you, even if your authentication detail is correct. Makes sense? Your meeting rooms, for example, your printer, your fax machines, right? All those can be now configured in the Active Directory. What else you can access? Your applications, right? You can register your applications into the Active Directory and then say, hey, these users or these groups have access to these applications. Make sense, right? So all of this can be done in the Active Directory. Now, how do you deploy Active Directory on premise? You have a server called Active Directory, and it has something called a domain. Okay, so when your computer, when you log in, it basically tries to identify a domain controller, and then domain controller gives them an address of the Active Directory. So when you're typing your username and password, it automatically locates your Active Directory and then tries to authenticate against that. Make sense? Right? When you move to the cloud, some of this functionality changes. Some of the functionality is not same when you move to the Azure Active Directory. So what is Azure Active Directory? If I put Azure in front of this,
so you're moving to cloud.
Yeah. So there is the Active Directory deployed in the cloud. Okay. It has certain functionality, but certain functionality it may not have. It has like users, group, permissions, some resources, applications, everything is there for the basis access and management. But think about like certain like fax and printers and things like that, which are deployed in organizations, internal network, which is not exposed to the cloud. You cannot manage that with the Active Directory. Makes sense? So there's certain differences, but overall it's a similar core functionality is same, right? So with the Active Directory, you can do cloud-based identity and access management. What it means is that when you authenticate, you are going to the Azure cloud, deployed Active Directory, and then you authenticate against that Active Directory whenever you are trying to log in or use the applications. Okay. It acts as an identity provider, means it has it has storage of all the identities, like of the users. Okay, it also manages the access. I don't know if you've used the Microsoft Office 365, right? Whenever you use Office 365, your access and authentication is done in the cloud with the Azure Directory. So you must have like a Hotmail address or something which you register with the Azure Active Directory. So when you open the 365 application on your laptop, it is authenticating against the Azure Active Directory. That is the only way you can get to Office 365 application. Okay. Even the Skype or LinkedIn authentication is now done through the Active Directory. So even when you log into LinkedIn, you are authenticating against the Active Directory deployed on Azure. Okay. So let's look at some of the functionalities by doing some labs. Okay. So let's do one thing. Let's go to the Azure portal. Let me show you how to set up that directory. let's log into portal.azure.com. Let me know once you're guys are in. Let's see my chat. So now, search for Active Directory. You will see Azure Active Directory here, right? Click on that. So by default, when you create an account, you are assigned an Active Directory node. I think this is what we talked about when like initially, right? So by default, you have one Active Directory for your account, which is linked to your account and subscription. Okay. Right now, if you have created a free account, you will be the only user in that directory. So right now, what I am showing you is the IT expert directory. So all the employees, contractors of the IT expert are in this directory. So here you can see 67 users, right? But for you, you might be only a single user in your directory, okay? So when you go to the Active Directory view, right, here it's going to show you the Active Directory root node information. Underneath that, the resource type, and then you are in the overview tab, right, where it shows you like what is the name of your directory, right? What is the tenant ID? Tenant ID means if you want to create multiple organizations within the Active Directory, as I said, like it's a hierarchical structure, so you can create them, okay? And this is important for certain organizations where they are like a separation of total, companies. So for example, like let's say there is the one company which is a group company, and then it has like multiple companies underneath that, right? They might create an Active Directory for the group company, and for each of the other companies which they own, they will create a tenant. If you do tenant way, they are automatically separated. Like one tenant's employee cannot access the resources of the other tenant. If like if you're an organization which has like 5 different companies, which work totally different way, you can create 5 different tenants. By default, you will have a single tenant if you have like all the employees within the same company, and then you want to manage them. So this is your tenant ID or company ID in Azure. This is a primary domain. This will be different from your account. Your primary domain might say account.onmicrosoft.com or something like that. Can you see that? Right? So you will always have onmicrosoft.com at the end if you have a free account. Okay, but we have our own domain in the Microsoft. So we have itexps.com as a domain. Make sense? And I'll talk to you about like how to set up this one. Your license is Azure AD free, correct? Because we are using a free account. Now, Azure AD has a different licensing mechanism based on what kind of functionality you need. Okay, you might need a premium account or other account if you want to do certain functionality in Azure AD. Okay, but core functionality is available in the free AD. Okay, and it is always given to, or it is always created when you have account with Azure. Okay, and there are few things like how many users, groups, applications, and devices registered. Okay, so for example, in IT Expert, you can see we have 67 users. Right, so if I click on this, it will show all the employees or the accounts of IT Expert. Make sense? Like for example, this is Harish, right? And his principal name is Haresh@itexps.com. Maybe this is the email which you might be using for contacting Haresh. Make sense? Right? Now, so these are all the users. So let me go back. And then we have groups, right? And then we have applications and we have devices. So if you go to 75 devices, it's all the laptops in the IT expert system, right? These are all the devices. But then there is something called device type, unmanaged devices, stale devices, non-compliant devices, and things like that. Okay. So let's start with the users. Okay. What you want to do in this lab is start the user. But before that, I want to talk about the domain, which is very important for any organization which is moving to the cloud, right? They don't want on Microsoft.com domain, which you have got with your free account. Makes sense, right? So to show you that, I'll have to go into a different tenant. So give me 1 second. This step is not required for me. I'm going to create a different tenant just to make sure that we are not confusing with the Itexps directory. And then from there, let me go here and create a tenant. I'm kind of like I'm creating a new company within the Itexps. Okay, in the Azure directory. There's something called managed tenant. I'm going to create a new tenant. Okay, it's a simple Azure Active Directory. Name. Let's say your organization, let's say anything like, okay, some hospital, right? Is going to the cloud, right? You can say, hey, Infotech hospital, just an example. And then I want my initial domain name to be Infotech HP for the hospital, right? You see here, when I'm creating this domain, it is adding on Microsoft.com at the end. Make sense? This is going to be my domain name for my new company. And you cannot change it. Meaning you cannot remove this. Let's see. Let me create this. Okay, I need to do some authentication. I'm not a robot. It's great. So let's go to the managed tenants. Yeah, so Infotech Hospital, you can see the domain name, right? So the first thing is, let me go to the Active Directory for this. So now I will similar to what you have. Okay. There are only one user, right? The way you have, right? Let me go to the home, go to the Active Directory. So now this will be similar to what we have. So for example, I have Infotech HP on Microsoft.com, right? It's not in itexps.com anymore. So the first thing is that when the organization wants to move to the cloud, they don't want on Microsoft.com, right? So for example, my hospital is Infotech HP. I want to have a domain called infotechhp.com. Makes sense, right? So what do you do if you want a custom domain for your company in the Azure AD? Okay. So the process is that you have to buy that custom domain, right? So today, when you want to buy a domain from a GoDaddy, for example, right? So if you want to set up your website, you go and buy a domain from the GoDaddy, right? Maybe infotech.com or whatever, right? So you first buy that domain. So you first own that domain, right? You don't buy it from Microsoft. Okay. You first buy and go to some domain registrar and own and buy that domain. So let's say my domain is infotechhp.com, which I bought. But now I want to use that domain in my Active Directory. Okay, so that all my users have email address like chris@infotechhp.com, right? Or narendra@infotechhp.com, right? Because currently I cannot do this, right? So first I need to own that domain. Once I purchase that domain, I come back here. And what do? I will show you the steps. So scroll down here. And then you should see something called a custom domain. You see a custom domain names. On the left blade, you see a blade called custom domain name. Click on that. So right now, whatever your domain is, it is there. It says it's available for you to use, right? Once you buy your domain, like infotechhp.com, let's say you can add that here. And say add custom domain. And then I can say infotechhp.com. Make sense? Let's say I bought infotechhp.com from GoDaddy. I come here and say I want to add this domain here. Okay, so I go here and say add the domain. Now the next step is, how does Microsoft know that I own the domain?
Next question.
Right? So what we need to do, the next step is I need to go to my domain registrar and put this entry. You see here? What it is saying is that to use infotechhp.com with your Azure AD, create a new TXT report with your domain registrar using the following info. So now you go to GoDaddy.com and say, I want to create a TXT record and then enter all this information. What is here? Once you do that, you can click on verify. Give me 1 second, my power is good. So you go to the GoDaddy.com and say, this is what you are doing a domain ownership transfer. You're saying that, hey, I want this domain to be used by Azure AD. Okay. To do that, you go to the GoDaddy and supply this information, and then click on verify. No, MX is for the mail servers. TXT record is for the domains. Okay, so you create this and then verify. So if you have created that right now in GoDaddy, for example, I went to GoDaddy, then I created this and if I click on verify, it will pass. But since I have not done that, my verification will fail. You see? Could not find the DNS record for this domain because I did not register it in my domain registrar. But if you do this, then your domain will be listed here. If it is available, then you can create the users under that domain. Make sense? So remember this process, this comes up in certifications. Like how do you create a custom domain in Azure AD directory? Because this is common. Any organization will not want on Microsoft.com domain. Right? They will have their own domain. They want to transfer that domain to Azure AD.
So you need to buy the domain.
They might already have it, right? So for example, Walmart, let's say walmart.com, they already have a domain. Now they want to move to Azure, right? So they take that domain and if they do this process, that domain will be transferred to Azure. Make sense? If they have user called chris@walmart.com or abc@walmart.com, their identity will not change.
Stay the same.
It will stay the same. Make sense? right? So this is the first step you do, right? Once it is verified, it will be available. Just remember this. Okay, so if it is verified, I can create a user called Naren@infotechsp.com. If it is not verified, it will not be available. It will not be available, then only I can create users in this domain. Make sense? Okay, so that's the first step. Once you do that, let's go to the users. Let's create a user. Right now, you will have only one user, right? The account owner. So whatever the email you use to create the your Azure account, right? That will be the only user you might have. Come on, what happened? Okay. So I have only Naren@itexps.com who has created this domain. So it is the only user, right? So if you want to create a new user, you click on this one. It's a new user. And then you have two options. Create new user or invite external user. Create new user is for the regular users of this organization. Okay. Invite external user is for the users whom you want to collaborate and expose certain resources from your organization. So you might have like B2B relationship with other companies. And then you want their users to access certain resources in your organization. You can invite them as an external user. Okay. So let's go through first to the regular user process. You have two templates here, create user or invite user. So create user will create the user in this directory right now. So let's say I'm going to create a Chris. So you can also do the same thing. Chris at infotechsp Microsoft.com. You see here the domain drop down. If other domain was verified, it will be available in the drop down. Like for example, Walmart.com or infotechsp.com. If that domain was verified, it will be available here. So I can use any of the domains to create my users. Okay. But since I have only this one account, I'll this domain only, I'll use that one. Let's say the name is Chris Green, and it is the same. Chris. And then you can add the optional attribute like first name is Chris, last name is Green, password. You can allow it to auto-generate a password, or you can create your own password for that user. Let's say create a password, initial password. Now, when you create an initial password, you have to supply that to the user. Right? So you can convey it by whatever way mechanism. And then there are a few other things. There's something called a block signing. Right now it says no. So for example, let's say employee is going to join your company, so you create upfront, but you do not want him to give an access until he shows up for the job on the first day, right? So you can create the user in advance, but you can say block sign in to yes. And when they join, you can turn it to no. Make sense? So even the user is created, if I block it, they will not be able to log in to my system. Make sense?
Until they start.
Yeah, until they start, for example. Okay. You can also restrict their location from where they can log in. Right. So you can use any country, for example, if that guy is in Europe or UK, you don't want them to use Afghanistan as a location, for example. So if you want to do those kind of restrictions, you can do that. And you can provide a job title, for example, he's a developer, for example. Which department? Let's say in the IT department, right? So on and so forth. If you have a manager, you can select a manager here as well. So this is the basic information you give, and then your create button. So click on that. This will create a new user. Make sense? So now you have a user, right, with a principal name like user at, oh, sorry, I need to refresh this. To get my new user. It's going slow. For you, are going slow.
I mean, I see the user.
You see it.
Yeah.
Why mine is going through that? It's taking so much time. Online, everybody's okay? Yeah, we don't have a question.
No, I was saying I'm okay. Thank you.
Okay. Hey, mine is very slow.
So what did I miss today? I started late.
Oh, you started late?
Yeah. I
So
just
I,
joined
so
like
I was
5
going
minutes
through
late.
the introduction of the AD, and then we are trying our first lab
Okay.
to create the Azure AD user. Okay, so you might not have missed much.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
But for me, there's something went wrong. That's pretty good.
Try signing out.
It looks like my computer. You see this one in the getting this again.
But now you're in the wild.
Yeah,
But that's what I'm saying.
let me see what happened. Wow, that's all the plot. The guy give me some few seconds. But something like that. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so let me look at my users. Okay, so we have the Chris Green user, right? Created. You see the user type is member, so it is a member of this Active Directory or this organization, right? And the identity you can see, right? Is this domain. Make sense? Right. So now with this information, this user can log in to the Active Directory. So if you want to try, you can go to a different browser or go to the incognito mode. And then let's go to portal.azure.com. And then you can use that user address, email address, and the user's identity, principal, and then the password. So let's say I want to log in, right? Let me log out. So we created a user called Chris, right? I'm going to say Chris at info.hp.onmicrosoft.com. You can use your domain address to do this, right? So use this address, Chris, and then your domain. And then click on next, it will ask me the password. Okay, so whatever the password I give, okay, enter that password and say sign in. Since it is my first attempt, right, it will ask me to change the password. Okay, I'm going to change my password. And then sign in. Password is gone. You should be able to log in as Chris. Make sense? Are you able to get it? Yeah. Use the Chris at domain, and then the password which you said, it will ask you to create a new password because the user is signing in for the first time, and then you should be able to get it.
Next.
Yeah. And once you're logged in, you will be able to see the information here, the principal and then the organization name. It will tell you which directory you are connected to. Are you able to see that?
It's asking for authenticator.
Hmm?
MFA.
You should not ask. Is it asking for everybody? The MFA? Okay, what about the online? Everybody is able to get in, or you have questions or issues? If it is asking for MFA, it's okay. You're still able to kind of get in, right?
All scan.
Hmm?
And then scan.
Oh, you're going to go through that whole process. You can do that if you want. But yeah, you can do it and quickly set it up. It's not a problem. Okay, but this is how you can create a new user in Azure directory. Okay, so this is for regular setup, right? Regular setup means all the company's employees or users who are using organizational resources, you can set it up like this, right? You can also invite external users. So for, let's say your company is working with another company, and some of the users of that company needs access to some of the resources in your company, right? How do you set that up, right? So let's say Walmart is doing a project with, let's say, some supplier of theirs, right? And then they want to work for like 6 months together to work on that project. Now the supplier is a different organization, and there are 10 users from that organization which need to access certain Walmart resources, right? How do you do that? You can invite those supplier users as the external guest users. So they can use their own email address to get into the Azure Active Directory, and then they can get resources assigned to them. They can get access to those. If you wanted to do that, you can do something like this. Go back to your users and then create a new user. Okay. You see the second option, invite external user to follow update with your organization. Click on that. So it will automatically select a template called invite user. Right? You can select invite user and then set up their identity. Let's say the identity of that external user is, let's say, some Robert, right? And his email address is in, let's do one thing. Let's say I want to invite Narendra from other organization. I want to use my address like this. I want to use my Gmail address. Make sense? So let's say anarlilaramani@gmail.com is an external user with whom you want to share certain resources. I want to invite him. I'm not going to create a user as a member, but I'm going to invite him. Okay. Once he accepts the invitation, then you will be able to join and log into my Active Directory. So you can use your own personal email address to invite yourself. And I can put a personal message saying, hey, I want to collaborate with you for this consulting assignment.
So can you,
Please join, give me one second, please join our org directory. So now I can use the Gmail account to sign into it. Makes sense? Okay. So when I go here, right, I can say, hey, same thing, right, and then invite. So what I'm doing is now inviting an external user. Now, if I check my email, Azure would have sent me an email. Makes sense? If I go to my email account, this is Microsoft invitation. Infotech Hospital invited you, right, to access applications within their organization. Right? And if I'm okay, I can click on join, and I'll accept the invitation, right? It will walk me through the process of like how do I, create my identity and log into their account. Make sense? Right? So this is a way you can invite other organizations to collaborate and then provide access to them. Once the consulting assignment is over, I'll just remove that user from my AD. Makes sense? In order to simplify that, I can create a group called consulting group, and I can delete the whole consulting group once that assignment is over. Make sense? Right? So these are the ways you can create the users. From certification perspective, you need to understand that you can have two kinds of users into Azure Active Directory. One is the member users and another is the guest users. Okay, and the use case, like member users are your own employees. External users are the employees working outside your organization who need resources for certain time. Okay.
for external users, you can set up permissions?
Yeah. Yeah, you will create a different group, different permissions for them.
So they'll be under their profile, right?
Yeah, they will have profile and everything. Once they log in, they will have profile, they will be able to see their groups and permissions. And
right. Well, you know, number sitting nasty emails on your.
Yeah. So all of those things you can do. So that's why you will create a consulting group and you will give them very restricted permissions. Okay, only those resources and applications they can use, which is useful for them to collaborate. Okay. Now, so this is how you can do group management. Now let's do user management. Oh, sorry, I did the other way. So this is how you can do the user management. Let's do the group management. So now let's go to the Active Directory which you have, and then click on a blade called groups. When you want to create a group, you click on the groups and then your new group button on the top. Right? So currently you will not have any groups because we haven't created any groups in our Azure Active Directory, right? So let's say I want to create a new group. I'll click on a new group. There are two group types you can create in Azure Active Directory: a security group and a 365 group. Right? So if you purchased a Microsoft Office 365 license, you will be able to create a group called Microsoft 365. Okay. So you can assign a user to a security group or a Office 365 group. For now, we'll just do a security group. And let's say a group name. So let's say IT admin is the group we are creating for all the administrators in IT department. And then you can say IT administrator. Make sense? And then the membership type, like how people become member of this group. If you notice this, right now, it says assigned, right? Assigned means you have to assign the users to this group. But it is disabled. For you, is it disabled or enabled? Disabled, right? Grayed out. Right? If you look at the information, it says select dynamic or assigned membership for the group. You see that? Okay. What it means is we can have two kinds of groups: assigned groups or dynamic groups. Assigned groups is where you assign users, so you manually select the users and put in the group. Dynamic means you can create a rule and users will become automatically part of the group if they pass the rule. Make sense? Right now it is grayed out because you are a free account. You're using free Azure AD. If you want to check out the dynamic groups, you have to create a premium account, which is also free for 30 days. I'll show you how to create it and then we'll create a dynamic group. Okay, let's create a static group. So you can say members here. There are no members right now, correct? You can click on no members selected and then select the members. If you click on that, on the right side, you will see add members screen. And you can add Chris to this group. So scroll down and select Chris Green. And then select and then create. So you select the users which you want to add to this group and then create. Once you do that, this group will be created. So far, so good?
Yeah.
By refresh, it should be able to create the group. It should list the group.
Microsoft.
Okay. Okay, so I have IT admin group now. Okay, and the membership type is assigned. So far, so good?
Yeah.
Okay. And then you can create this group and then assign permissions and things like that. Okay. But that's fine. Now, let me show you how to create dynamic group. Give me 1 second. Can you click on this privileged access group preview activity? And you will see this message: to use privileged identity management, your organization must have this membership or this license. If you see this AD Premium P2, that is the license you require in order to create a dynamic. So let's do that. If you click on Learn More, okay, and then click on this Get Free Trial. You see Get Free Trial, it will give you a free trial. Make sense? So click on this free trial thing and activate. So on the activate side, what I wanted to activate is Azure AD Premium P2. It's a free trial, so it will not charge you. Okay, so click on free trial and then click on activate. So remember, there are different licensing mechanisms available for Azure AD. Azure AD Premium is needed if you want to have functionality like dynamic groups. Okay, so once it is activated, generally it is fast. Let's go back to the groups again. Let's refresh it. Let's go to the all groups. Sometimes it takes time to recognize that it is activated. So let's click on the new group. And you see this is now enabled membership type. You see? Let me show you how to create a dynamic group. So let's say you want to put all the HR employees who are joining the HR department, right, into an HR group automatically. That's it. So let's say I want to create a group name called the HR group, and say human resources department. Now any employee which joins the human resources department, I want to now automatically put them into this group. Okay, so let's say how to do that. So the membership type, I would want you to select a dynamic user. Okay, you just select a dynamic user. Okay, and then you will have this dynamic user members, right? You see, instead of members, now it is saying dynamic user members and add dynamic query. So click on add dynamic query. Now here you can create rules, and based on the rules, users will automatically join or leave the group. So let's say you want any user whose department is HR to directly put them into this group, right? So you see here there is a condition, choose property. So if you click on that drop down, it will show which properties you can use for this condition. And you can see a lot of them, right? For example, city. If a user is in Shopberg, I want to put them in some group, I can do that, right? If the country, the department, let's say I want to say any user whose department equals to, select here equals, which is like a SQL query, and value is HR. A user whose department name is HR, I want to put them into this group. And I can add more conditions if I want. I want to say, let's say only US people, then I can add condition and say, not only department equals to HR, but country equals to US, I want to put them in this group. So I can do and or like a SQL. Okay. And once you have done that, you can tab out and then click on save. You see the rule syntax, you will be able to see. Question?
All right. Sorry, yeah. Is it like a attribute-based control?
Yeah, so this is based on the user attributes.
Okay.
So all these are the user attributes, like the display name, job title, email address, department, right? Based on that, you want to dynamically put them into certain group.
So yeah, there is a role-based and attribute, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And then you can click on save. Once you have created that, you can click on create. And this group will be created. So this is a dynamic group now. Okay. So now if you refresh this, this makes much more administration much more easier, right? Like anytime you create a user, put the right department, they'll be directly going into this group. Makes sense? So now if you see this group, it says it's a dynamic department. What it means is, let's say tomorrow Katie joins the organization and she is working for HR. So when creating the user, when you say department is HR, right? And when you create the user, she'll be automatically part of HR and get all the permissions to resources and applications based on that. But let's say tomorrow she applies within the organization and switches to the sales department. So you go and change her department to sales, she will be removed from this group automatically. Right? And if you had created another group for sales, she'll be joining that group. Makes sense? It makes easier this way to create and manage the dynamic groups. Okay. All right, so we covered group types, membership. Let's look at a couple of other things. Now, this is good for adding the users and groups into your Azure AD when you're starting up. But let's think about an organization like a Walmart or big organizations who have tens of thousands of users already set up. Now you want to move them to Azure AD. That one by one is not going to work for them, right? So they allow you to do bulk user operations. Instead of like adding user one by one like this, you can upload all the user information, all the 10,000 users at once, and then let it process it. Makes sense, right? So you have bulk user and bulk membership operations available in Azure AD. Okay, how do you do that? Basically, what you do is you create an Excel file or CSV file with all the user properties and then upload it. Okay, and it will process them. Let me show you that as well. If you go to Azure AD here and go to your users. So this is where we create the users, right? On the top, you will see a drop-down called bulk operations, right? So the way it works is like, if you want to like bulk upload the users, you click here and then say bulk. How do you know in which format you need to upload the users? The first step is download the CSV template. Okay, if you don't have it, you can download the template. So you can give a template and you just need to fill out with all the users. In fact, what happens in Windows Active Directory, there is a facility you can export them in a CSV file and then import here as a bulk user. Make sense?
From AD.
Yeah, from AD. So from the on-prem AD, you export them as a CSV file, right? And then make sure that it matches this template, and then you can upload it to the Azure AD, and you are done. Okay, so for example, here, if I download this template, you click on download, it will download a CSV file for you, which you can open in Excel format. That way. If you see here, oh, this is not the CSV format. So this is the format, right? This is name of the user, for example, right? Then you put the username, which is the principal name, right? So you can put it like this. Name and your domain, right? And then your initial password. Log sign in, yes or no, right? First name, last name, all these things are optional, right? So let's say I have this user called Rob, I live, right? I want to upload it. So let's put my domain is infotech.xp, right? I'm going to change this. And then my password is fine. And then let me put in the HR department. So let's see if it gets added to the HR or not. Okay. So you get this template in short, and then you can fill out with all the users which you want to upload, right? So the required properties are display name, username, password, right? And these others are optional. Okay. So whatever you are able to fill it out. Okay. Let me save this. And then what happens is you go back again there and then upload. Okay, once you filled that out, the third step is to upload. So you click on that, select the file. If there is a format issue, it will tell you immediately. Like if you're not done in the same format, it will tell you that you're not following the format. But if the format is same, it will say uploaded successfully. And then you can say, hey, submit. When you submit, it will start creating those users. Make sense? Right. And you can see the operations and the notification. Once it is done, you see bulk operation results here. We'll say, okay, completed with no errors. So that means one user was created successfully. Right. If I go back here to the all users, let's see your Robert. You see this one? Right? So this was created to the bulk update. This is a member, right? And since we put the HR department, let's see in the HR group if it is added automatically or not. If I go to this user, right? And then if I look at the groups, it's part of the HR group. You can see that. I don't have to do anything. Right? Because he joined HR department, I just uploaded. Now the user is created as part of the HR department. If I change his department, within 2 hours, he will be removed from this group. Make sense? Right? So this is how you manage your users and groups and things like that. Make sense? Yeah, it is a very powerful tool. It is very much needed, right? Now, again, there are a couple of scenarios you need to think about. It sometimes comes up in the certification is that think like this. You're an organization, right? Let's say you're Walmart, for example. I don't know why I'm saying Walmart today. Maybe. But let's say they are like 250K employees, for example, right? And they are part of the on-prem Active Directory. Now let's say they are moving to Azure cloud. Right? They have two options. If they want to move all the authentication to the cloud, as I said, they can do bulk update. They can download all those things into a CSV file, right? And then they can upload it here. Make sense? That way these guys will be all migrated to the Azure Active Directory in the cloud. But let's say they don't want to do that for some reasons like security, privacy, and other things. They want to keep their users here only, meaning in their on-premise and I'll say AAD here. This is Azure Active Directory. This is Windows Active Directory. They want to move to the cloud, but they don't want to move authentication and user information here permanently. They still want to authenticate to the data center. Right? So let's say, as we discussed in our networking, they set up a express route, right? And then they connect. Right? What do they do about the authentication? What you want is like anybody who is trying to access some resource here, you want them to go here, authenticate, and come back. Make sense? This is also possible. Okay. What they can do is use something called AD Connect. There's something called AD Connect. AD Connect allows your on-prem Active Directory to connect to the Azure Active Directory. So it will synchronize certain things between the two. Okay. Now, one way is that the users will come here and then go here and authenticate. Another way is that you synchronize them. With the AD Connect, you have two-way synchronization.
But are they going to have all their access to the resources?
Yeah. You can set up the resource access in the Active Directory, but the authentication part is done on-prem. But that is not what people prefer. What people prefer is that they want to do authentication on the cloud itself.
Yeah, what's the point of going to cloud? You have to.
Yeah. Yeah. So what they do is instead of doing this manual route of upload and download, they can do AD sync. In AD sync, what happens is like all the users from here is synced to the Active Directory automatically. Once you set up the AD sync, all the users will be synced up. Now, when you do syncing, the problem is if somebody changes the password afterwards here, what happens?
Then they can't sync the other side.
Yeah, so either we can sync it here, but then what happens is they change it here, we need to sync it here, right?
Two ways.
So it can do two-way syncing if you want. A lot of times you can do one-way syncing. You can say, hey, I want password to be stored here, but not here. Meaning, sorry, I want password to be at both sides, but only password change I want to do here only, not here. That is also possible. There's something called password write back. So whenever somebody changes the password here, right, they would allow a password write back to the on-prem. We'll talk about that in a minute. But there are a few other options. How do you sync between the on-prem and Active Directory? Because organizations might already have the directory and everything set up. They don't want to just do bulk update. They might want to say sync other things as well. So they can either connect to sync between Azure Active Directory and the Windows Active Directory. The primary authentication route is still through the Azure Active Directory. Okay, because that is simpler. It gives you more control. There are other things like MFA, you can set it up. I'll not go too much detail into this, but there are ways you can, strengthen the authentication mechanism. Okay. We'll look at some of the methods, the way available for authentication, right? So a simple authentication is like a single identity authentication where user can use the username and password to authenticate and get access to the resources. The more stringent way is to do multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication basically means you have additional authentication mechanism applied in order to get access. So the password itself is not enough. You want an additional mechanism. Additional mechanism could be your phone, a hardware device. It could be email, right? Anything else which proves your identity and your ownership of things, like an ownership of like a mobile device, for example. Like when you give your mobile phone, right? The SMS will be sent to you. So if you own it, then only you will be able to authenticate, right? So mobile device is something you own, right? Face recognition, for example, right? You own that, right? Your retina, authentication, right? Some account you own, for example, email account, right? It is an additional mechanism of security or authentication which you can set up, right? So you can set up all these authentication mechanisms in Azure, okay? And then you can use that. So I've given you as a homework. So I've given step by step how you can set up a MFA device like authenticator, right? To set up authentication, multi-factor authentication for either one user, multiple user, one group, all groups, or all the users. Right? So you can select. So for example, let's say I'm okay for my employees to use only password, but consultants, I want them to do multi-factor authentication, right? So then you will set up multi-factor authentication only for a particular group or set of groups. Or you can say, no, everybody should have multi-factor authentication. You can do it like that as well, right? So I have given you steps on how to set up a MFA for a particular user. So try that out, okay? And then you can set up any device. You can set up authenticator app, and you can use email or whatever. The other part is after setting up users and groups, you want to set of devices. Right? Devices also are called enterprise resources. You can use or manage the enterprise resources like devices through Azure as well. Okay. Now, there are two groups of devices when it comes to Azure Active Directory. Managed or unmanaged devices. Managed devices means it is managed by Azure AD and your organization. So typically, if the organization is giving devices or handing out devices to the employees, right, that will be managed devices. Unmanaged is still that you're giving access to the users, but it's not organization's own device, right? So for example, if they want you to work from home, right, and then be on support call, they might ask you to use your phone, right? So the phone is owned by you, it's not by the employer, right? But still, you want to access certain resources in your organization for like production support or something like that, right? So it will be unmanaged device. It will be registered device, but unmanaged device. If the employer gives you the phone, it will be the managed device. So this is how you can categorize between the devices in the Azure AD. Okay, and you can enable or disable the device. If you find that some devices suspectful, right? It is doing suspicious activities, you can immediately go and disable the device so that user will not be able to get in from that device. Make sense? For example, your employee, you are given a company laptop, but you lost a laptop or it got stolen. You can immediately call the company saying, hey, my laptop was stolen. Immediately they will disable the device. What it will happen is like the user, right, or the person who got the laptop, right, will not be able to log on to your network and do anything.
You could initially wipe through Intune. You could do it like a wipe through Intune.
Same thing from here. You can do it this as well.
Okay.
From here you can disable and then say wipe.
That's what I did.
Yeah. So what happens is like for wiping, the problem is what if he got handle of your password as well? So wiping works when they don't have your password. Makes sense?
Yeah.
Right? So this is like if you disable it, they'll not be able to even log into the company network. Right? So even if they have password, they will not be able to log in and do anything with that laptop. Okay. So what happens is like, and this is automatic. Okay. Either you can add a device or this could be automatic. So whenever the user first uses the device, right, it can join. Right? There are like three kinds of joins in Active Directory: a registered user, a join, and hybrid join. Right? It depends on like how it is managed. A registered device is likely widely used. It allows any operating system to join the Azure AD. It's mainly Windows or iOS or Android or Mac OS. Okay. So when you're using your mobile phone, for example, so your device will be registered once you use that device for the first time to join, and that your device is allowed. Okay. A registered device can do SSO through the Azure cloud. So you can use single sign-on to get into multiple applications or resources which are given access to your device. Okay. Typically, these things like consultant or users who use the personal mobile phone or personal VPN to get into the network can use this. A joint device is like an organization's own device, right? Strictly in Azure AD, you can only join Windows 10 devices. So your mobile phones, you cannot have as a joint device, okay? And you can do SSO to cloud and on-prem, etc. So this is where, when the company has given you a laptop, right, which is company owned, then it will be joining this group to the joined device. Hybrid joined is like when you have company owned device, but old one. So for example, you might be using still Windows 8.1, right? Then in your data centers, for example, then you can do a hybrid join. There are three kinds of joins. The idea behind this device is that they are registered onto the Azure AD, and Azure AD will allow them to go through authentication and then provide them access of functionality through which they can access multiple resources. Okay. So if you want to look at that, you go to the portal, go back to your AD, and then there should be a devices section here. You see the devices? Right now, you won't see any devices here, right? So still, like I was showing you in Itexps, there are like a lot of devices and things like that. All the Itexps laptops and mobile phones and everything is joined there, right? But right now, it says none of them are, right? So when you do your MFA exercise, homework, you will see that your mobile phone number will appear here as a registered device because you authenticated through that, okay? And then you can do devices. So if you go to all devices, it will show up all of the devices here. Since we haven't done it, it doesn't show up, right? But once you have it, you see these buttons enable and disable, right? So if the device gets stolen or something, right, you can disable those devices immediately from. Okay. And then you have like device settings, for example, here. Right, this is the join devices, right? And then you have settings like user may join devices to Azure AD, right? So you can select which devices can join all the devices, right? User may register all the devices with Azure AD. Require multi-factor authentication to register or join the devices, right? So all of these settings are available for you to use. Okay, if you don't want all the devices, but only selected devices, you can select here and then say, okay, these are the users who can join the devices. Makes sense? Okay. User may register the devices on Azure AD. You can select all or none. Okay. And then in order to join or register, you need to use multi-factor authentication. So for example, if I say, you know what, this user can do or register their device, when that user uses a mobile phone to get into it, right? Or sorry, anything, right? It will do multi-factor authentication. So first time when you're joining it or accessing it from mobile, it might ask you to check your email to confirm. You go to the email and then confirm, and then only that device will be able to join, right? But if you don't want MFA, by default, it is saying it's not required, but you can set it. Make sense? And there are other things like, you know, password reset. So we'll talk about that maybe after a break. So let's see what is the time. Yes, 11:35. So we'll take a 15-minute break and we'll talk about some more functionalities around Azure AD after the break. Okay, so we'll meet at 11:50. Okay. All right. Hopefully everybody is back. Okay. Let's look at some of the other things on the Azure AD. So one of the problems is the password reset, right? So once let's say you're set up like users, right? Now, as the time goes on, right? Sometimes user needs to change their password. Nowadays, you know, organizations force their users to change the password at like 180 days or whatever, right? Not only that, like if the user thinks that that password is compromised, right? If you set up this way, user does not control, really do not have control over the password, right? Because they have to go to the admin to set up the password and then things like that. So the user thinks their password has been compromised, right? They might have to follow a process in order to reset their password, right? So and nowadays you see self-service password reset mechanisms, right? For example, if I lose my Gmail password, right, or I forgot my password, for example, right? Then Google gives me a process, or Microsoft gives me a process through which I can change it, right? On the organization front, sometimes it is not that simple. So you have to set that up. Now, if you don't set that up, the problem is that administrator gets involved, right? And administrator will now be spending a lot of time lot of their time in order to like set up reset the user password. So to free them up from that, you can set up a self-service password reset as well in Azure AD, and you can provide the rules like how to do that. Okay, so again, you can set up for like all the users or group specific users, and then you can specify how they can reset the password if they need to, or they forgot the password, or in order to change their password. Okay, so in order to do that, let me show you that as well. Here. If you go to your Active Directory, you should have a section for that on the left side called password reset. Do you see that password reset blade? Just few lines above the monitoring. Okay. So when you do that, right, it will say what and how you want to set up this option. By default, it is none, so it is not enabled. Okay, so self-service password reset is not enabled in Azure AD by default. So you can either select set of users who can reset their own passwords or all the users. If I say all users, right? And then I can say save. So when I do this step, what it means is that users can reset their own passwords. But then how is defined by other property. So under the password reset properties, you have this single common property which enables or disabled, and then other things. So for example, which authentication methods they use in order to reset the password. Right? So you can say, hey, how many methods you want users to use in order to reset the password. Make sense? It says number of methods required to reset. So you can have multiple factors or a single way of doing that. Okay. If I say, okay, they can select one method to reset the password. By default, it is one. I can do two as well. Okay. If I do one, then it will say which methods are available. Right? Can they use their email to reset the password? Can they use their mobile phone, their office phone, their mobile app? Or should we ask the security questions? Make sense? I can enable all the methods. Make sense? So remember, these are the methods available to them. They can use any one of them because I said one, right? Make sense? So when I want to reset the password, it will say, how do you want to reset your password? Do you want to use a mobile phone? Do you want to use your email? Or will you answer the security questions? Make sense? Right?
So if they use the phone, they will need to authenticate, right?
Yeah. So when they say, hey, I want to reset the password using my mobile phone, right? Then you see mobile app code. Yeah. So then what Azure will do, it will send a authentication code on the mobile app which they have to enter in order to reset their password. The flow is like this. Let's say I forgot the password or I want to reset the password, right? So I go and say, hey, forgot password, right? Then it will say enter your email, right? They enter the email, right? Then based on what I have set up here, it will start the process. So let's say I say only one method, and that one method is a mobile app code, right? That means as soon as they put their email address, it will say, hey, I have sent you a code to the registered mobile. Enter that code here. Make sense? Then they have to look at their mobile phone. The code will come. Let's say 6-digit code came 528978. If that code matches, then it will say enter your new password. Make sense? But if I say they have an option to email as well, right? Then Microsoft will say, okay, send the code to your email address, registered email address, and then go to check your email and then put the code here. Makes sense? Or I can say security questions, right? So in security questions, what happens if I've done this? When the user first registers themselves, right, they will answer 5 questions. So they can set up 5 questions first time. And then out of that, how many they need to answer correctly in order to reset their password. So when the user says, I want to reset through the questions, then it will ask you 3 questions out of this 5 questions. And then all the answers should be correct in order to set up the new password. Make sense? Right? And I can say, no, if I say 2 methods, then it will use 2 of the methods. It might use email as well as the mobile app. It will ask you both things to enter. It will say, enter your mobile app code and enter your email code in order to reset the password. Make sense?
Is it recommended to have 2?
It is recommended to have.
Yeah, sometimes one doesn't work.
Yeah. So it is recommended to have more security, right? So it can say, hey, if you want to reset your password, you have to use 2 methods. I'm going to send you a code on your mobile phone and email. You need to enter both the codes in order to set your new password. Make sense? Or email and security question, or mobile and security question.
Sometimes it's very difficult to teach users. It's like, why is this asking me 2 times to authenticate?
Yeah,
like,
but
they don't understand what's the security behind that.
Yeah, but that is a security, right?
Right.
So they have to comply with that.
And I just tell them, go reach out to security.
Yeah. Then they can call the security team. Okay.
Yeah, why the users don't know? It's like, oh my God.
Yeah. So if I say 5 questions to register and 3, right? So then you can set up like what questions we are going to ask, and then they will enter the answers, and then out of them it will select like 3 or 4 or 5, whatever you select. Make sense? So this is how you can set up the password reset. This is one of the big headache for administrators if they have to do the password reset for the users. This will allow users to securely reset their password. Make sense?
Can you also do unlocking accounts?
Yeah, locking and unlocking you can do.
Same thing.
Yeah, same thing. Okay. You can also set up the registrations and the notifications. So require users to register when sign in, right? So you can say yes and say number of days before users are asked to reconfirm the authentication information. This is 180. 180 days after that, they'll be asked again to reset the password and things like that. Notifications allow you to see if a user has reset the password. Okay, so basically it will say notify users on password resets. That's for the users, and notify all admins when other admins reset the password. Right? So you can be notified on both the things. Okay. Some customizations you can do, for example, when an email is sent for users to reset, you can send the customized hyperlinks to them, or URLs where you need to go to them, or you want them to connect to if there's any problems, for example, right? So you can things like that, you can put it here. This is a help desk link, right? Meaning if they had issues, right, where they can go. Right. So if you want to put a link, you can put a link here. Okay. And this is I was talking about on-premise integration where we don't have it, but let's say the user's passwords are in the on-prem directory, and then you want them to reset on the Azure AD. For this to work, you have to do something called a password write back. Okay, so you have to enable something called password write back onto your Windows Active Directory on-prem in order for Azure AD new password to sync back to your Azure on-prem AD. Okay, so just remember, if this is required, you need to enable something called password write back onto your on-prem AD to get the new password to the on-prem. Oh, sorry, yeah, on-prem. Okay. These are some of the security things. Okay, so let me show you before we move to the access. Let me show you a few other things. If you go back to your Active Directory, some of the security options are under the security blade here. Can you see the security here? Click on that. It will tell you like what kind of security things you can do. Okay. So there are some documentation links here if you wanted to look at that. And then under the security on the left side, you can set up few more things. Multi-factor authentication, you can set it up here. See multi-factor authentication. Okay. So you can do things here, multi-factor authentications. For example, if somebody's account is locked out, right? You can configure the account lockout attempt and how they can get back into the account, for example. Okay. Let's see. If you wanted to do a one-time bypass, you can do this. Okay. Or sometimes if it doesn't work and you want one-time bypass of the MFA, you can set up some rules here. Okay. It will tell which are the users which are bypassed during that time. What else? Providers, for example. You can put the multi-factor authentication providers and add them here. So right now, the two multi-factor authentication mechanism, like use like authenticator app, for example. But then if, let's say, organization wants to use RSA tokens or hardware devices, they can register here. And then it will appear in the authentication methods. Your phone call settings and things like that. So there are a lot of other things which you can set up for each of the security, property. Let me go back here. You can also specify authentication methods here. You see, these are all the available methods of authentication. Right now, the only one which is available for authentication is email OTP, which is enabled as yes. You can see that. If you want to enable others, for example, you want to enable SMS as a authentication method, what you can do is you can click on SMS and then just enable it and save. So now it is one of the authentication methods which user can choose in order to authenticate. Makes sense? So those settings are here. Like my Microsoft Authenticator application right now, it is saying not enabled. If you want to enable, you go there and say enable this. And you can enable for all users or certain groups or only selected users. Make sense? So there's a lot of options are there. You see, like if I want to say all multi-factor authentication through the Authenticator app. So first I go here and then enable it. When I enable, I say only for the IT admins. Right? So when the IT admin logs in their MFA, right, they will be shown an option to use the Authenticator app, but other users will not be able to see that option. Make sense? So this is how you can control at a granular level who can use which authentication mechanism to get or authenticate against the Active Directory. And as I said, you can add authentication methods. When you add, it will available here, and then you can enable or disable them from here. For example, if there is a wide security issue going on with, let's say, SMS, I can come here and just disable this. Even if it's assigned to everybody, they'll not be able to use that mechanism. Unless I find out the root cause and fix that, I can just disable that. Okay? And things like that. Right? So these are all mechanisms available from the authentication purpose. Now let's talk about authorization or access policies. Okay. In Azure, we have role-based access policy. Okay, so in order for someone to access certain resource, right, they need a roles and permissions enabled for them. Okay, which is called RBAC. RBAC stands for role-based access control. Azure follows the RBAC mechanism in order to verify access to a resource for an authenticated user. Okay, so the way role-based access works is that you have first your identity proven, which we call principal. A principal is given access to a resource with given permissions. So principal is given a role. Based on the role, they can access the resources. Make sense? So there are like 3-step process. First, we need to have a principal. Principal means some authenticated identity. Authenticated identity could be a user, a group, a service principal, or managed identity. User and groups, we have seen that. Means what it means is a role can be assigned to a user, a role can be assigned to a group, a role can be assigned to something called a service principal, and role can be assigned to something called a managed identity. We'll talk about the managed identity in a bit, but user and groups for which we have learned right now, correct? So those are called principals. Once you are authenticated, you have principal with you. Now that principal, in order to access a resource like an application or a device or maybe a room or whatever, right? They need a role. Okay, so what is the role? So in Azure, you have something called a role definition, which gives you fine-grained access to the resources. You see, a role definition looks something like this. There's a role name called owner, contributor, reader, backup operator, or whatever. And then there's something called a role definition, means what they can do. Role definition tells the role what they can do. Make sense? Right? And then it should have a scope. For example, if I say you are an administrator, but administrator of what? Right? That's a scope. You are an administrator of a VM, for example, or you are an administrator of a storage account, right? So that's a third thing, which is a scope. Makes sense? Now the role definition can be a built-in or custom. So there are a lot of built-in role definition already there. Okay. So most of the time you can use any built-in role which is proper for a particular user or particular group or a particular identity. Right? Sometimes if you want to customize it, you can customize it. Okay. A role definition is like a JSON file like this. Right? So this is like an example of contributor role, JSON file. And it is very simple in terms to understand how you assign that. It's not very difficult to create a role definition file. It has typically 3 or 4 items in that. One is called actions, what they can do, right? Not actions, what they cannot do, right? Data actions, which is what they can or cannot do on the data. And then the scope. Make sense? 5 sections. Okay. And then using this 5-section syntax, you can create your own roles if needed. Once you have a role, you have an identity, you can join them with something called a role assignment. Role assignment joins a principal to a role in a given scope. Make sense? Let's look at an example of that. Here's an example, actually. Any security principal, you have marketing group. Okay, in the marketing group, you have some certain role called contributor. Here is the role definition, and here is the scope. A scope can be anything. So if you remember, like we talked about the policy and compliance hierarchies, right? You can have management group, subscriptions, resource group, and resource. You can assign a role at any of these levels. Okay, so let me show you that. When you create a role definition, right? A scope can be any of these. At the highest level, it could be a management group. Under the management group, you can have subscriptions. Right? Under the subscriptions, you have resource groups. And under the resource group, we have resources. You remember, this is a hierarchy which you can create, right? Any of these levels of the hierarchy could be a scope for the role. So I can create a owner role, and I can put that at a subscription level, right? If I put an owner role at the subscription level, that means that owner role gets propagated to everything under that subscription. Make sense? So if I have given full access to a subscription, any resource group and any resources within that, I have access to everything. Make sense? It is called inherited, right? So the role definitions are inherited from any of these levels. The highest level is management group. Under that, you can put it under a subscription or a resource group or individual resource. So I can create a user saying, hey, this user will have only access to this VM. What I'm doing is I'm creating a role definition at the resource level. Or I can say that this user can manage all the resources in this resource group, for example, or everything under a subscription or everything under a management group. Make sense? Right. Let's look at like how to do that. Right. This is the nitty-gritty of how it is done. Let's go into the portal again. Might be able to do this quickly. So let me switch to somewhere I can create the sources. Let me go to my Itexps tenant. Problem is I don't have the admin access to the Active Directory, but let's look at the role assignment. So let's create a storage account. So that's the simplest of the resource you can create, right? I'm going to create a storage account and then we'll talk about the role assignments. So let's say you also create a storage account and then you can create a new lab, for example. And I'm going to give the storage account name, input tag SA3, and not much here. And then let's review and create quickly. So that's how we use the storage account. And now, so since till now, right, whatever we have been doing, we have access to everything, right? Because we are the owner of the account. Now let's say you created some users, and then you want to give specific user a specific access to the storage account, right? Let's see how to do that. And this applies to all the resources in the Azure, okay? Any resource you create, except certain resources, which are very rare, you will always see this blade called access control, which we have not explored till now. You see here, access control, IAM, click on that. This is where you set up like who can access your resources and not. So we are at the storage account level, right? And you are into something called access control. Access control blade gives you information about who has access to the storage account. And matter of fact, any resource you create on Azure will have this blade. And you can control access from this blade. Okay? So if you go here and the access control, you have a few buttons here, right? It says my access. My access is like whoever is logged in what is their access level or permission level on this resource. So if I want to check and view my access, I can click on this button called View My Access. Can you see that? View My Access.
Yeah.
Click on that. It will tell you what kind of permissions you have in the storage account. Do you see a current role assignments here? You see there's an owner role. That means you have owner role on the storage account. Means you own this storage account. Make sense? What is the description? Grants full access to manage everything, right? Correct? But did we define that assignment? No, right? You all automatically got it. How did you get it? See the scope, subscription inherited. Means you are given an owner role at the subscription level. So whatever you create under that subscription gets an owner role. Make sense? Whatever you have been creating under this subscription, every resource you have an owner role. Why? Because when you created the subscription, you get automatically an owner role on the subscription. Make sense? So your role is not granted for this particular resource, it is inherited from your subscription. So from here. So you are given ownership role here. So whatever you create underneath that, you get owner role automatically. This is called inherited. Make sense? But let's say I wanted to give access to only particular user. I can add it. Okay? And I'll show you how to do that. But before I do that, let's say, sorry. There is another button here, check access. You can see that? Right? So if I want to check somebody else's access, like does Chris have access to this? Right? You can do this here. Click on check access. And then it is asking you for whom you want to check the access. So I can say Chris, right? For example. Correct? Or any user. So for you, can you type Chris and see if you can see Chris screen there? Right? So click on that and see what access that user has. Does the user have any access? It will show you current role assignments. Right now it's saying 0. I don't have any access to this resource. So if I log in as nrlilaramani at gmail.com, I will not be able to access this Infotech asset tree. In fact, if you are still logged in as a Chris in another browser, you will not be able to see Infotech asset tree over there on your storage account. Why? Because that user does not have access. Make sense? Any of the users which we have created today, like a Rob or Chris, does not have access to anything yet. They can log into your directory, but they cannot do anything. We didn't give them access. So how do we give them the access? Right? So let's go to how to give the access capabilities.
Don't put a ticket
No. We say grant access to this resource, right? So add role assignment. You can go and add role assignment. When you do that, you have two things, roles and members. First, you have to define which role, and then you will define who are the members. You see, as you go to the add role assignment, you see all the roles, which are built-in roles, right? There are thousands or not thousands, hundreds of built-in roles available. Okay, now you need to understand a couple of things about the roles in Azure Active Directory. Yeah, we have a question.
Oh, yes. Like AWS, can you create your custom policy?
Yeah, you can create. I'll show you how to do it. Okay. So you have roles, right? Now roles, there are two kinds of roles in the Azure. There is a general role this specific role. General role is most of like security kind of role, like at the resource level, what you can do, what you cannot do. Specific role depends on the resource. Right. So for example, if my resource is Cosmos DB, I can do certain operations on Cosmos DB, right? So what kind of operations I can do specifically will be part of the specific role. General role gives me access like general access. There are 3 general roles in Azure, which is available for everything. And those are listed on the top. So if you go to the roles, you see the first 3 general roles: owner, contributor, and leader. Right? The first 3 roles you will always see the general roles: owner, contributor, and leader. These apply to all the resources in your resource directory. Owner means they have full access. They can not only go to that resource, do anything, they can also assign other users access to those resources. That's the owner, full control. Right? A contributor role is almost like an owner role, but the only thing is that they cannot assign a role to the particular resource, to any other one or any other members. That is the only difference between owner and contributor. Contributor can do anything with all the resources, but or except that they cannot give role permissions to other members on the roles, which can be done by owner. A reader role is only the read-only view. So it has a view access. So for example, if I'm a reader of a storage account, I can view the properties of a storage account, but I cannot go and upload a file onto a blob, for example. Make sense? I can read, but I cannot do any write or updatable operations. Make sense? Right? So those are the general rules. And then there's category specific rules. So for example, this is storage specific rule. Roles, not rules. Backup contributor is a storage specific category because generally backups work on the storage, right? So now let's look at how the role definition looks like. So let's say I want to give control or read a role to someone like to Chris on the storage account. So what do they get? So for example, let's look at the reader role definition. If you want to view the definition, there is something called details. And you can click on view. So it will tell you what are the permissions they have, right? These are all the permissions. You see here. They have 500 out of the total 6052 permission on this role. Right? There's read permission, read domain service, all of these permissions are given to the reader role. Make sense? If I want to see the JSON view, this is very important. You click on JSON, it will show you the policy definition. Make sense? You see here, it is very simple to read and understand. Again, so from the certification perspective, this is important. So if you want to understand this, this file, it's only 19 line long. Okay. Properties is basically gives you a role name, assignable scopes, in which scope you can assign this role. This is a general role, so it is saying slash. Everything is assigned at every category you can assign this role. In the permissions, you see actions. Say all the actions which has a read, or all the read actions. It doesn't matter what is previous, but all the read actions store gets. Make sense? And then not actions. And there is something called data actions and non-data actions. So there are 2 sections. The actions and no actions are at the resource level. Data actions and no data actions is at the data level. So storage is a resource, but blob entry is a data. Make sense? So even if I give a write permission on the storage level, but if I don't give data action to the blob, they can still not write to the blob. Make sense? Because that's a data action. Make sense? So resource actions and data action. And I can provide a definition for that. Make sense? Right. So this is how you create a JSON file. And then there is something called assignments. Okay, there is no assignment given right now. Let's close this first. Let's say, let's modify a role as well. Let's say I want to give a contributor role to somebody. But before that, I want to add something else to the contributor role. So I want to create my custom role, which is almost like a contributor role, right? But I want them to do something additional. So I want to create a custom role. Okay. So how do you do that? Let's see. I go to contributor. Let's select this role. Give me 1 second there. Let's see what is the. At least let's assign a reader role to Chris, and then I'll show you how to modify the role. I'm going to select a reader role, go to the next. It's going to ask you members. So select your Chris here. So here you have select members, right? Click on select members and select Chris here. I'm going to select my Gmail account. And then I'm going to select. So this is how you do a role assignment. You can select a group or a user. So if I want to give whole HR, right, reader access to this, I can add a HR as well. I can say HR. Okay. And select. Okay. And then once it is done, I can say review and assign. Okay, this is how you can give assignments. So you can assign roles for a particular scope. Now, what we have done is assign a role at the storage level. I could have gone up to the resource group level and assigned a role, or I could get to the subscription level and assign a role. The permissions are inherited. Make sense? Okay, now let's look at how to create a custom role. Give me 1 second. So if you go to access control, beside the role assignment, you have something called roles, where all the roles will be listed. Make sense? In the IAM, you have third tab called roles. So if you want to customize your role, go there. Okay, not in the role assignment, but go to the roles. So let's say I want to create a custom role, but not from the scratch. But let's say I want to use the contributor role and just modify certain things in that. So the first thing I will do is something like this. Select this role. And you see these 3 dots? You say clone. Clone means duplicate this role. So click on clone. And then you can create a custom role name. Right? So you can say, hey, I want to create a blob contributor role. Okay. And then I want to create it by cloning the role called contributor. So far, so good. Then next is I'm going to decide the permissions. So these are the permissions it has got from the cloning the role. Make sense? Right? So these are all the permissions it has got already. Okay. But let's say I want to add some more permission. I want to give this contributor some more detailed access onto the blob. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say add permission. Right, so our role is blob contributor, and then I want to give the permission. When you want to give the permission, it is, as I said, a category specific. So you need to give a category, or generally we call it resource provider here. Okay, so select a category and then select a permission from that. So let's say it's a storage related. So I'm going to search for storage category. Then it looks for Microsoft storage. Here, select a Microsoft storage. And then let's say I want to give them, some additional roles like writing to the blog or something like that. So you see that that resource provider has so many permissions which you can select from. So let's say search for a blog. So if you go at the end, I mean, you can select anything. So let's say I want to give access to a write blog, read blog, right? And for the containers, I want to allow them to patch container, for example. Select few permissions basically and add it. So now what we have done is we took all the permissions of the contributor role and then we added some more permissions to create our custom role. And then if you want to look at its JSON file, so you can say where you can assign it. Right now it's on the storage accounts, right? Because we have selected certain categories from the storage, but you can assign and you can create this role at the other scopes as well. Make sense? Means I can create this role and I can say this role is available only for the storage category. Or I can say this role is available everywhere on the management groups and subscriptions and everywhere. So if you want to add it, you can add it here. And then finally, it will show you the JSON format. Right, and you can add it still here if you want. Okay, so what permissions we had? Like we had all the actions, and then we also added some of these actions as well. Okay, you can also select certain data actions and add it here. Okay, and once you have customized your role like this, if you're fine with like whatever it is showing, then you can just say review and create, and then click on create. Okay. Now we have a new role called blob contributor. This can be assigned to anyone now going forward. Make sense? Right. So this is how you can create a custom roles and assign. So far so good. Now there's something called deny assignments. Now this is very rare, but you can use it. This overrides the role assignments. This overrides the role assignments. So for example, let's say I have created a storage account for HR group, and I give everybody access, the whole group access to the storage account, right? But then let's say I want to assign access to everyone, but only one person I don't want to assign access, hypothetically, right? So now how I can do that? Because if I don't want to assign that one person, I have two choices. Either I remove him from the HR group, but then it will remove his access to everything else, which the HR group needs, right? Then I have to either create a new group or like remove that user, etc. But let's say I don't want to do that. I can come here and say, hey, for this storage account, I'll give everybody from the HR access, but only this person will not be allowed access. If you want to do that, you can do deny assignment. So what happens is like this. When anybody authenticates, whenever somebody logs in, right, there's a service called ARM or Azure Resource Manager. That's when you authenticate. So that when you authenticate, you are given an access based on your roles, right? So when that access is evaluated, the first is a deny assignments. Okay, so if it says your assignment is denied, that is the first thing it will check. So for that user for whom you did the deny assignment, he will not get access to the storage, but he will get access to everything else. So design as assignments are evaluated first before the role assignments are evaluated. Okay, so if you wanted to do certain things like that, you can do it this way as well. Okay, means create your normal role assignments, but then you in rare conditions you want to do deny assignments like a few people in the group or few other things in the group, you can do that in the deny assignments. Okay. All right, so this is about the role of assignments. Now, one of the principles we looked at the managed identities, right? So we know what the user is, we know what the group is, right? Those are the identities and the principals who can be given the role and permissions. Right? So there are other things also which can be given permissions. One of them is called managed identities in the Azure. Okay, so what is managed identity? The managed identity eliminates the needs for developers having to manage credentials to access other services. So think about this. Your organization is creating an application. That application needs an access to a storage account. Now, you can give that permission to that application in two ways. You can run that application on certain user or group account, and that user or group account can be given a role, right? And or you can use that user keys or API keys in order to get access to the storage account. We were talking about that last time, right? Like if your storage account keys, you can get access to that storage account. But the problem with that is the application needs to store that storage key somewhere, right? So in order to avoid this, right, what I can do is I can create something called a managed identity. Okay, a managed identity is something you can assign to an Azure resource. You cannot assign to a user, you cannot assign to a group, but you can assign to a resource. It's like a group, it's like a user. Okay, and then it can use to obtain the tokens, and then based on what kind of managed identity is, it can be assigned the roles. And that identity can be assigned to your resources. So for example, like this. So you have a VM, which needs an access to a storage account. Right? The one way is that when you run the application here, right, you can give an access key here. But then the problem is that access key has to be stored either within the application or some vault or something, and then this application needs to do something extra to have access. Instead, you can create a managed identity. Or let's say you create a managed identity called a web app. One. Once you create this managed identity, you can provide roles. So you can say a web app one managed identity has a, let's say, a read-write role on the storage account. You create a role to access this and then provide an access. Okay. Once you have done that, what you can say is that VM, the resource VM, can be assigned this identity. So anything which runs under on this VM automatically gets this read-write role onto the storage. That way you don't have to do anything about storing the account keys and exposing that. So this is another way of securing your resources. So you can create managed access, managed identities, and then provide the access. So what happens is when your resource starts, like VM or something, it will first go to the Azure AD, authenticate with that, get that role, and then will be able to access the storage. Here, there is no involvement of keys or anything like that. Okay. Most of the past services which Azure provides, like SQL Server or Cosmos DB, they create the managed identities for themselves. You can use those identities and apply to the resources like VMs from where, or applications from where you want to access those resources. Okay. There are like two kinds of identities. You need to worry about that. I mean, one is you create it, another is service creates it. Meaning, when you deploy a Cosmos DB service or when you deploy a SQL service, it will create the service identities for themselves. Or you can create your managed identity and then assign to them. Okay. Okay. Now let's see how much time we have. So based on that, we can talk about a few other things. Okay, so this one mostly about the Azure AD and the role-based access control. Now, these are all part of the core security platform of Azure. Okay, there are other things which you already learned in the networking class, right? Things like firewalls, like NSG, subnets, right? Routing and firewalls, for example, how to use them. Right? They are also part of the Azure platform security. So let's look at a couple of things around here. Whenever you look at the cloud security model, we call it a shared responsibility model, right? Meaning, when you go to a cloud, it's not cloud provider's responsibility only to secure your stuff, right? You, as an enterprise, are also responsible for some part of the security. Meaning, when you create a VM, for example, right? When you create a VM, you're asked to create a user account, right? Where you create the username and password, right? Now, if you give that password to someone else, right, you are compromising the security, but it's your responsibility to make sure that password is secure. Makes sense, right? So it's called a shared security model or shared responsibility model, right? There are certain responsibilities which lies with Azure AD, certain responsibilities which lies with the customer who is using the Azure cloud for the security. And you need to understand the boundaries, like who's responsible for what part of the security, right? So for example, security starts from a physical data center. So Azure has data centers all around the world. Who is responsible for the security of those data centers? Obviously Azure. Makes sense, right? Operating system, for example. Oh, give me 1 second. So I start from there. Information and data, for example, right? So if you're using SaaS model, right, it's all Azure's responsibility. Okay. So in the past, also it is Azure's responsibility, right? And then you have on-prem, right? So you're like 3 delivery models. So 4 delivery models: on-prem, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. If you're not on-prem, you are responsible for everything, right? Because you are not using cloud. Makes sense, right? If you're using cloud and if you're using infrastructure as a security model, right? Then physical host, network, and data center, Azure is responsible for securing that because that's not in your control, right? Meaning Azure's data center, for example, right? The security of that lies with Microsoft. So if there is any breach there, right, it's Microsoft's responsibility. But let's say your VM, your operating system, you are responsible. For example, you're not sharing your password, right? Your network controls, applications which you are deploying on your VM. Azure doesn't know what applications you're deploying on your VM, right? All of that is your responsibility. But let's say you are using a PaaS service. You have another question?
Yes, in IaaS, in the operating system section, right? It's a customer responsibility.
Right.
Right. So who take care of the update of the operating system and patches and everything?
Yeah, so patches and operating system generally Azure will take care, but again, you as a customer has to configure that. Makes sense?
Okay.
Like Azure is responsible for that, for the patches, etc. But it will not automatically install the patches until you tell them, saying, hey, on which day and time you want to deploy, because Azure doesn't know. Maybe you are 24/7 running application on that VM.
Okay, so you still have to configure that.
You still have to configure that.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Otherwise, if Azure does it automatically, they will bring down your VM and your users will not be able to access it, right? So same thing with the network control. But like if you're using PaaS, right, you don't have even access to the operating system. So then Azure is responsible for maintaining those, right? Same way like applications, whatever you're deploying, if you're at the IaaS level, you are responsible. But if you are using SaaS, then you don't have even access to the application configuration. So Azure is responsible for that. Make sense? Information and data, you are always responsible for, right? Because what data you are storing, what information you are storing, Azure do not have control over that. So for example, you are using SQL Server service from Azure, like platform as a service, right? But then you're using maybe for a patient application, and then your patient have SSN number, which you're supposed to encrypt it, right? Azure does not have control over that. So your information and data you're storing encrypted or not, or how to secure it is always your responsibility. It doesn't matter which delivery model you are using. Same thing with the devices and accounts and identities, right? Because if you add somebody in your account, it's your responsibility that they also behave responsibly and use the Azure services properly. Everything below that depends on which layer you are working, etc. Right? But simple things like passwords you are responsible for. Data you are responsible for because your application is writing the data. Azure doesn't know, is it a sensitive data you are writing, and do you need to do PCI compliance or encryption or anonymization of the data? That is all your responsibility. Okay. Infrastructure security, I think that's we know it's all Azure. Platform integrity and security is also part of the Microsoft, and part of that is customer. If you want to find out things about how secure your account is, you have few tools available at your disposal in Azure. So Azure has something called Security Center. That Security Center is responsible for continuously scanning the resources provisioned in your Azure account, and then provide you certain recommendations. Like, are you compliant with the security or not? Are there security breaches going on? Have you configured certain things based on the security practices or best practices or not? All of that is provided by Security Center. Now, Security Center has, again, the levels, right? The basic security recommendations, you will get it for free. If you want more detailed security report, you have to upgrade to a higher paying model. Okay. If you want to look at that, let's go to the portal, for example, and then search for security. And then click on security. So there's some documentation around like what kind of security is applicable and how do you do that. So the best practices, guidance, all of that is available here. Okay. If you want to find out security recommendations, you have something called Security Center here. So if you click on that, it will tell you on your subscription if you have issues with your security or not, right? Now, certain things are free, certain things will ask you to, if you want detailed, recommendation, they will ask you to upgrade your subscription, like something like Microsoft Defender for Cloud, okay, which gives you more things, right? So, but then You can get identity and access recommendations like this and upgrade and get all of those, right? There are certain things you will get it for free, certain things you do pay for, okay? And then you can say troubleshooting. So what this allows is like, you can, not only it will tell you what are the problems with your security, it will also allow you how to remediate that. For example, it might say your password, policy is not stringent enough, right? So you can click on that and then change the password policy, for example, okay? So things like password protection policies and things like that, it will give you. I don't have access, but you can click on those and you should be able to see in your subscription. But this is one of the tools for security. If you go for a paid version, not only you can do a security, it will do security recommendation for your AD cloud, Azure AD Cloud. You can also set up your on-prem security as well. So it can scan your on-prem resources and then give you security recommendation. Okay. The other way to do it is through something called Azure policy. Okay. So let's look at this because sometimes this comes up, not sometimes, couple of questions they might ask you on this in the certification exam. Okay. So you have something called Azure policy as well as part of your one of the tools in security model. Right? The core security model is IAM, user, groups, roles, permission. Right? That's a solid one, you can say. The shared security responsibility model is where you need to do something where Microsoft does something. Security Center is a tool which will help you with the recommendation, meaning what is going wrong according to the Security Center in your current resources, and then you can have recommendation. Policy is somewhere between these two. Generally, I call it safety and security. Security is something where you can exactly say who can do what, and based on that, you can either allow or deny the access, right? Safety is like being just safe. Make sense? Right? So let me give you one example before we go on to the Azure policy. So we just created a storage account, right? Let's go back to the storage account. I want to show you something. I created a storage account. You must have created that as well, right? Now, from the security perspective, I set up IAM, right? Meaning I can go and say only the users whom I give the access, they can access this storage account. Make sense? Right? That's my security setup. But I want to be safe. What does that mean? Meaning, I've given this access to all the administrators, saying, hey, they can go and do whatever on the storage account because they're administrators, right? So let's say I give access to the administrators. They can do whatever. I mean, they're responsible, they're IT admins, right? So I give them access to configure all this. But let's say this storage account now is used by my application in the production, right? What if somebody, by mistake, some administrator goes and deletes the storage account? All my orders, all my things are gone. Maybe I have 10 years worth of data gone in one shot, right? I want to be safe. Yes, backup and all those things are safety purpose, right? Disaster recovery, right? Let's say once it is in production, I don't want anybody to delete this, even if I've given all of those accesses. I have safety things. One of the safety things in Azure is something called resource logs. If you go here and then look for logs under setting. Under setting, you have something called a logs. These are called resource logs. I can lock a resource. Okay. So let's say this storage account is used in production and I don't want anybody to delete this, no matter what it is. Right. So I can go and add a log. I can say add, right? And then I can provide a log saying, hey, production log. Meaning, accidentally somebody should not go and delete. So you have two kinds of logs, read only and delete. If I put a delete log, that means that's it. I'll put a lock on this storage account. This is my safety. Makes sense? Now what happens? I am the owner. I should be able to do anything with the storage account, right? Makes sense? Let me go and try to delete this. I go to overview. Hey, I want to delete the storage account. Maybe I was in a party yesterday. Didn't realize I was logged into the production instead of some other account or some other subscription. I tried to delete it. You see the message? Infotech SSD cannot be deleted. You are the owner, it is telling you this. Because this resource, as parent has a delete lock access. Immediately you will realize that you are doing something wrong. Makes sense? This is a safety feature. And it's not a security thing. Security wise, I have access to the whole storage account. I can do whatever I want. Right? But this is my safety feature. Meaning, as an administrator, I really want to delete, I can delete that lock and delete it. Make sense? If I really want to delete it, I can go back to delete that lock and then delete this. But this is safety. Sometimes, I'm in a hurry if I'm trying to do something, right? It will tell me immediately, hey, you cannot do this. It's a production storage. What are you trying to do?
Well, that's why it's grayed out, right?
Yes, grayed out. I cannot delete it. Unless I delete that lock, I cannot delete this. Understand? As an administrator, I can go and delete that lock.
There's a
And
reason
then
why.
delete it, right? But this is like when I'm doing something accidentally, right? I want to prevent it, right? So there's a safety feature called resource lock. Any resource can be locked like this. There are two kinds of locks, delete lock and read-only lock. I can say you can do anything, but you cannot modify this resource. I can put a read-only lock. I can put a delete lock, right? So that by mistake, somebody do not mess up with my critical resources. Yeah, we have question.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a delete lock on, can anybody modify it?
Yeah, they can
Okay.
modify everything. They can do whatever they want. But what they cannot do is delete this account.
Okay, so in read mode, like they cannot modify it.
Right, in read mode, they cannot modify. So for example, I want something to for audit purpose, right? I don't want anybody to make any modifications, right? I can just put a read lock on that saying, hey, today or not, nobody modifies this resource. Make sense?
Got it. Thank you.
So these are safety features. They are not part of security, but they are additional safety which I can implement. Same with the policies. Right? Azure policies are safety mechanisms or compliance mechanisms, in other words, which I can implement at an account level, subscription level, or any levels beyond that. Now, the policies could be because certain government compliance rules like PCI DSS, for example, or HIPAA compliance, or maybe related to security. I do not want certain things to happen, or it could be because I want to enforce certain policies. Could be anything. I mean, for example, let's say my application users are in US East. I do not want somebody to by mistake deploy resources in US West when my users are in US East, for example. Make sense? I want to make a policy that this application is only available in not only available, is only deployed in US East region and nowhere else. So all the resources in that group, I want to be in particular location. I can enforce a policy like that, right? So policy is a safety mechanism, a security mechanism, and a compliance mechanism. Policies like roles can be applied at the management level, a subscription level, a resource group level, or a resource level. Okay. Policy definitions are also like role definitions, but they have a different format. They have if then else structure. So they have two sections in policy: if else and effect. If something like this, then what I want to do? Do I want to enforce the policy or I just want to audit it? Right? So the levels of safety can be defined within the policy. Okay. And you can have multiple policies, right? And you can like group them together and then apply that whole group to a particular resource or a management group, which is called a policy initiative. Okay, so remember three things. Policy, right, has a definition. Okay. Policy definition contains condition and effect. You can group the policies. That group is called initiative, and that initiative can be also applied. So instead of applying individual policies to the resource and groups level, you can also create an initiative which is set of policies and can be applied. Okay. So let's look at how to work with the policies. If you go to Azure and look for policy, it's a separate service. Azure. So if you go to the policy, the first screen you see is the policy compliance. And you can see it says, I have overall 5% resource compliance because I have applied certain default policies on my account. Right? So policy is based on the scope. You can see scope here, it says by account or subscription. I can change this level. Policy can be applied to a management group level, subscription level, or resource group level. You see that? Right. Can be at the management group level, subscription level, or resource group level. Okay. We can apply them. Once it is applied, it gets evaluated. Every day it evaluates and sees how many resources or how many resources are compliant. It's compliant with your policy. Okay. It gives you the audit report like this. Like 1 is compliant, 0 is exempt, and 18 are non-compliant. If I want to see which are the resources not compliant, right, you can see that here. Okay. Do you see this? These are the policies. Okay. And you're saying this policy is not compliant in certain resources.
So you have to go back and make it.
Yeah. Then you can take a decision what you want to do. Okay. Now, as I said, policy could be enforced or it could be optional. Like right now, it is just complaining that it's not compliant. It's not removing those resources or they're not stopping those resources from running. Like it says that they're not in compliance with my policy, for example, right? But I can be very strict, saying before they deploy, if it is not compliant with my policy, I'll not even allow them to deploy. I can do that as well. Okay, so policy could be, the effect could be at any safety level. Okay, but let's look at it. So for example,
Or like maybe like a password policy. That one of them.
yeah, password policy is one of them. Yeah. So let's say you want to create a policy or you want to apply a policy. You can start with the authoring. You see the authoring section?
Yes.
And you will click on definitions. So it will show you all the built-in policies here first. So click on definitions and it will show you all the built-in policies. So I have created 2 custom policies where it is showing not compliant, but you can see here. Scope, you can filter on the scope, definition type, category, and anything you can search here. Okay. So right now it is showing you all the policies under this scope. Okay. You see your policy name, your type, your definition type, and the category.
Yeah.
Makes sense? So it says, hey, there is a policy name, the type is built-in. Definition type is policy. So you have 2 definition types. Either it is a policy or it's an initiative. Okay. And then category where it applies to. Makes sense? Right? Like Kubernetes, there is a policy here. Storage, there is a policy here. Okay. And you can use all these built-in policies or you can create your own definitions. Makes sense? What I want you to do is, in the search, can you search for things like location, for example? So I want to see certain location-based policies. So I'm just searching on location. Right? And then it will filter here, right? Let me expand that. Okay. So now I have certain policies related to locations. Right. Now let me look at. There's something called allowed locations. You can see that. When you search for locations, you'll see this kind of definitions like allowed locations of a resource groups. Make sense? So let's click on allowed locations policy. And let's look at the definition. When you click on that, it will show you the definition in the JSON format. You can see the description. It says, this policy enables you to restrict the locations your organizations can specify within the your resource groups or resource or whatever, right? You can enforce this. So when you're deploying the resources, you can say, hey, you can deploy only in particular region, for example. Make sense? If you look at the definition, it's something like this. Let me show you the definition. It has something called properties where you have a display name, policy type, and description. The main thing to look at here is parameters and the policy rule. So let's look at the policy rule. What is it enforcing first? You want to see what is it is enforcing first is policy rule. And it has a if condition. So it's easy to read. If all of the field location, right, is not in list of allowed locations, right, and then the policy is not global, right, then deny. You see this deny?
Yes.
Right. So read this. If all of the field location, so in your resources, there is a location, right? Yeah. If it is not part of the allowed locations, right, then deny the deployment. So this is like enforced policy. Somebody, if I put this policy in, right, at the subscription level, and then say allowed locations are only US West and US East, right? Whenever somebody creates, let's say you create a storage account, you will not be able to specify any other location than US East or US West. It will not create that resource. It will say your policy doesn't allow this. Okay. Or my effect could be just audit, meaning I want them to create it, but this is best practice, and I want to audit. If somebody creates a resource outside my locations, I want to just tell them that they are not compliant, but I will not stop them. Right? So your effect can be denied, your effect could be audit only or anything like that. And like two or three effects you can have. So this is strictly enforced deny. Make sense? Right? So let's say I want to assign this policy. So if I want to assign this policy, I can click on this assign button. And then select a scope. Do I want to assign at the subscription level, management group level, resource group level, or resource level? Let's say I want to do it this at the resource group level. So I can say, subscription is Azure 2000, and then my resource group is, let's say, Labs 1. Right? So this policy scope is only Labs 1. So all the resources deployed in Labs 1 group will follow this policy. Okay, I select that. Right? If I want to allow any exclusions, I can specify that. Like it's like a deny assignment, right? I want to take some certain exceptions, I can do that. And then policy has allowed locations as a parameter. So I need to specify the locations, right? Makes sense? Let's click on next. Okay. Let's not worry about this. Let's go next. It says parameters. Yes, I need to say which locations are allowed, right? I select from here, let's say US, US, and West US. That's it. This is now enforced policy. On my last one, right? Any resource you try to deploy has to be in the US East or US West. If I try to deploy a resource and specify a different region, it will not even deploy that resource. Make sense? Right? You can create your own policies as well, following the same definition. Okay, so you can say, you know, I want to change it or customize it, like the way we customize the role, right? You can start with one policy and customize it. Okay. And there are a lot of built-in policies and custom policies already available. So like you don't have to code it. You can get it from like GitHub and all of that. So a lot of policies are available. So you can just copy and paste and then assign your policies to your subscription or management group or resource group. So this is another way you can, you know, enforce security in Azure. Make sense? This is used by a lot of compliance. So if you, let me show you one thing before we leave. So I go here. So policies are like individual policies here. But let's say the definition. And you can run the compliance at any time. You can go to compliance and run and see